Hello, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am joined by Terminal Philosophy for episode 2 of our History of Warfare. So, in our previous episode, we discussed the Stone Age. And one of the things that, when we look at ancient history, we sort of classify it by the material from which the tools are made from. So, there's the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. You could argue the Modern Age is the Steel Age. So what we see with stones, we mentioned, is that you can't really make armor out of stones, but you can make relatively lethal missile weapons, and like we saw with the Aztecs, war clubs. So it would seem that the offense had the upper hand. He who struck first would win. Waiting around to get hit would just risk you losing an arm. So you don't want to do that. You want to hit and run, smash and grab. But what metal does is, not only is, of course, metal provide a harder, sharper edge, it's less brittle, metal also can be shaped. So you can wear it as armor. And so the Bronze Age really is crucial in that it allows for the defense to have the upper hand now. Trying to, if you have even bronze weapons, but let's stick to stone weapons, trying to go up against bronze, you're not going to get, it's going to be very difficult to get through. So now the defense has more of an advantage now. You can take a few hits and not immediately bleed out and die. Now with bronze, the main problem with bronze was that tin was a very limited resource. And bronze is an alloy made of copper and tin. And so while it was extremely effective as armor for the time, and fairly lethal for weapons, the main problem, or the main limiting factor, was access to tin. So where if we use the rule of thumb from the New World, that Stone Age armies could often be these large, loose formations of footmen, Bronze Age armies are going to be smaller. They're going to be smaller for two reasons. One is, we've already mentioned, the limiting factor of tin. Two is something we'll get to in a little bit later, the chariot, which is heavily tied up. Any sort of equestrian society typically is an aristocratic one, which means a few men hold most of the land. So those two factors are going to make Bronze Age warfare primarily smaller scale than we might see compared to the vast armies the Incas and the Aztecs were able to rise up. And so what you see now is, once you have full body armor, usually you could have a solid cuirass made out of a solid piece of bronze, or you could have a tunic which has bronze scales sewn onto it, which is called lamellar or scale mail, and you can then use that to have flexibility and protection, as well as a helmet. And now stone just doesn't cut it anymore. Now a fully equipped Bronze Age warrior versus an opponent using stone would probably be as well protected as Cortez's men were against the Aztecs. And so they could, really punch above their weight. So even though they were maybe small in number, given their professionalization, their equipment and training, it probably wasn't as much of a handicap as one might think it would be, which leads to, this also then drives the arms race for weapons that are not just of our 1 and 2 category, hunting or farming implements, but actual dedicated weapons of war, the mace and the axe and the sword. The mace and the axe come to predominance because you can use them they're specially designed to deal with the armor. So to go back to our RPG mode, maces deal crush damage. And the whole point is not necessarily to break through the armor or to pierce it, but to deliver such force that it transmits through the armor, rupturing organs and shattering bones. The other thing you could do is the axe, which would use pierce damage to, basically what the axe does is it puts as much of the energy as possible in a small front to punch through the armor, which it's a similar concept to what we'll see much later in the 20th century with heat charges, where you have a shaped charge that focuses this explosion into a very small area to pierce tank armor. So you want to maximize the amount of force applied to the minimum amount of space. And so those two weapons rise to predominance, which is why you see pharaohs or Babylonian or Sumerian kings on stela wielding maces and axes, because these are especially designed to sort of crack open the lobster, if you will. So what we see now is that this is huge. This metallurgical leap gives the first person to discover it, not only discover it, but also control the trade routes that make it possible. Because it's so expensive to buy bronze, the common people, yeomen, aren't going to be able to afford it. And so you'll have this permanent advantage against them, much like the medieval knight had over the medieval peasant. You're just not going to be able to afford the kit that he has. And we see a somewhat similar class division, whereas there's this military aristocracy encased in bronze versus poorly organized, poorly equipped peasant armies that just aren't going to stand up. So what are some of your thoughts on that?
I think that's a great introduction. One of the first things that I have to say is that the warfare between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age is really big, in the sense that warfare started to become more complex, but not on a mass scale, not just yet. That would come later in the Iron Age conflicts. This age really shows the sharp contrast between states and conquerors with organized military units and Bronze Age weapons and armor versus city-states and kingdoms and those who lacked those innovations. So the contrast was just fairly self-evident. Late Stone Age fighters stood little chance against Bronze Age fighters. As you were saying before, the introduction of armor created the demand for specialized weapons. And a lot of the weapons that you'd see common in ancient Egypt, for example, like the Kopesh or the harpy or the falx or things like maces, axes, and swords, almost all these weapons had their introduction in the Bronze Age, but then later would change to iron in the New Kingdom period. So, and then of course we'll talk about this later, but we have the introduction of specialized units and formations like the phalanx and the chariot. And as war became more technical and more complex, that created the demand for further innovations, and it created strains and demands on certain materials like tin, like copper, and the Egyptians would find themselves in a copper shortage for tools for their workers for things like monuments, and would force them to put those materials towards warfare. So yes, there was still a material scarcity at this time. Yeah, those are just my initial thoughts.
Yeah. Now, the primary weapon system of the Bronze Age is the war chariot. And the chariot, there are three sort of technical components that go into the chariot. There is the wheel, the domestication of the horse, and the composite bow. Without getting into too much detail about how and when they were invented, by around the year 2000 BC, this triple threat had arrived where all three technologies fell into place. And they were first implemented on a large scale by Indo-Aryan, Indo-European inhabitants of the Western Steppe. The Western Steppe is the region from Hungary to Kazakhstan. And that area, which would later produce the Scythians, the Sarmatians, the other nomadic peoples, would invent this combination. Now, with the composite bow, it is essentially twofold, right? It's what's made up of. It's made of composite materials, sinew, bone, and horn, and that allows for flexibility and durability. Now, the main limitation on the composite bow, and we'll see this again throughout history, is that the kind of adhesive that's used is made from animal products, and in very wet environments like in India or in Southeast Asia, the bows tend to rot and unglue themselves. So they tend to be very effective in colder or drier climates where moisture doesn't destroy the glue. So we see the dominance of this all across the steppe, across the Near East, and across China, areas that are not known for being super wet or super hot and wet. So, and then when you look at that, the way the chariots are used, there's been a sort of debate on the use of the chariot, and there's pretty much three options on the table. One is the mobile firing platform, which we seem to see in the biblical accounts in Kadesh, and in other classic chariot warfare engagements. Chariots is a battle taxi. Homer seems to recount heroes using chariots, mostly to get around, not to fight from. Caesar indicates that the Britons who were using chariots in his own day used it for a similar purpose. And this kind of technique would, in the 18th century, 19th century, be called the dragoon. The dragoon is a man that moves on horseback, but fights on foot. So he uses the horse for the mobility, but that's it. So we could argue that the idea of the dragoon is a Bronze Age concept. And then, which I think is the least plausible, is that of a shock weapon, much like a medieval knight or a cataphract of the late antiquity. And the obvious problems would be, what happens when chariots collide? Is it just bumper cars that you can't disentangle? Also, given that you're behind the horses, how are you going to reach out and touch somebody? You're gonna wield a pike. That doesn't seem really all that useful or effective. And I would argue we don't really have a lot of evidence to believe they were intended to be used as shock weapons, at least until Cyrus the Great. And without getting into scythe chariots, there is something that Xenophon writes in his Cyropaedia, which I think is informative and illustrative of how chariots up to his time, the 5th and 4th centuries BC, were used. He writes, the old Trojan style of charioteering, still in use to this day among the Cyrenians, he abolished because before his time the Medes, the Syrians, the Arabians, and all Asiatics generally used their chariots in the same way as the Cyrenians do. The fault of the system, to his mind, was that the very flower of his army, if the picked men were in the chariots, could only act at long range, and so contribute little after all to the victory. 300 chariots meant 1,200 horses and 300 fighting men, besides the charioteers, who would naturally be men above the common, in whom the warriors could place confidence, and that meant another 300 debarred from injuring the enemy in any kind of way. And then later on in the account, he writes, from the point of view of one of Cyrus's generals, suppose you heard of chariots made on a new pattern, not to be kept motionless, standing as hitherto with their backs to the foe, as if for flight, but with horses shielded by armor and drivers sheltered by wooden walls and protected by breastplates and helmets, and axles fitted with iron sides so they can charge straight into the enemy foe. So it sounds like up until Cyrus, chariots were never even considered being used as shock weapons, but as battle taxis and mobile firing platforms. And as a mobile firing platform, it seems to be, from what Xenophon is saying, that the cab, the exit, the sort of backside of the cab where you step into, was facing the enemy, so the archer could fire aim shots at him. And as the enemy infantry closed in, the chariot would then gallop away, stop, and rinse and repeat. And you'd hopefully whittle down the enemy until you could then dismount and fight him in hand-to-hand combat. I think given that the nomadic peoples had a tendency to fight with these sort of swarming tactics where you just sort of surround the enemy and pour fire into him and then run away, and then pour fire into him and then run away. And once he's fragmented and broken up, you move in for the kill. I don't see why chariot warfare would have been any different. It's the same kind of people. And they have a great, despite the technological changes we see throughout the 3,000 years of the nomads, the tactical formations are very much the same all the way through. And while we don't have any direct written accounts, I think it's quite plausible to understand that this is the case. And I'll leave you with this. Imagine having these new chariot armies riding out of the steppe, as we saw with India, with the Aryan invaders, or in Egypt with the Hyksos. And you're armed with stone. You might have clubs and bows and arrows, but you have really very little armor. And then these guys come in, kitted out in bronze swords and bronze arrow tips for their recurved bows. And they just start, laying down fire on you. And then once you're disrupted, they dismount and start, cutting you to pieces with their kopeshas. I mean, if you're a Stone Age army, you're done.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. With the invention of the chariot, it's really fascinating. It's more or less agreed upon that it came together around 2000 BC, as you were saying, in modern-day Kazakhstan on that North European plain in the steppe. And with our previous conversations with the Mongols and the Magyars, the invention of the chariot in that part of the world makes sense given just how flat it is and how conducive it is to cavalry-like warfare. With the chariot of antiquity, you have this general dichotomy, as you mentioned before, where chariots can be used as either this mobile firing platform, as this hammer against heavier infantry formations like the phalanx, or used as transport. One of the most interesting and well-known accounts that we have is the Battle of Kadesh, where it was Ramses II, the Egyptians versus the Hittites. And it's more or less agreed upon that this is one of the oldest accounts of armies using formations of chariots as both shock weapons and as mobile firing platforms. For example, when the Hittites started raiding the Egyptian camp, they were great at being mobile firing platforms, but as soon as they became sort of bogged down and bottlenecked in the Egyptian camp, well, they started to take a lot of casualties, and both sides really suffered a lot of casualties in their chariot units, is what is more or less agreed upon. And the Hittite chariots were chased down by the Egyptians, and you were possibly referencing beforehand that you can use the chariot as sort of a platform to use as a Parthian shot, like the ancient Iranians. So yeah, I think what makes the chariot so unique in this era is that when you have these peoples coming out of the steppe and the Hittites coming into Asia Minor and conquering, it would be really quite a psychological trip to see both formations of infantry with spears and swords and axes, but then also to come up against this mobile dynamic unit, using it either as sort of like a battering ram type of a thing, which I think the success of that is I guess we could just leave it more or less at 50-50 for the time being, or as a mobile firing platform, and as well as to take officers on and off the battlefield. So I think for their time they were good, but I think they were very prone to high casualties just given sometimes the bulkiness of them. For example, the Hittites had larger chariots where it would include 3 people. It might have a spearman, an archer, and a driver. Well, I don't know. It's just this big cumbersome thing at that point with 3 men on a platform. So yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that.
Well, and it is interesting too that it's generally agreed upon the Egyptian chariots were of a lighter construction and therefore more mobile, and in general have a superior track record on the battlefield, which would indicate that the strength of the chariot was its speed and flexibility. Now, what's interesting with Kadesh is so we don't really have any direct written accounts of the Aryan invasion of India or the Hyksos invasion of Egypt, but it's like a vast tech difference. We have horses and bronze, and you don't, so we just wipe you out and conquer this big empire really quick. But once enough of the empires of the Near East achieve rough parity, right? Because the problem with these sort of you want to call it the Bronze Age military-industrial complex, is you need large stables to raise and breed war horses. You need craftsmen to build large amounts of chariot carriages. You need control of trade routes to get tin to make your bronze, and then smelt the bronze into weapons and armor. It takes an empire of a certain size to be able to do that. It's just too cost intensive. And I think that's partly why these smaller city states end up being gobbled up by the Hittites, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians, because they just don't really have the means to be able to feed this Bronze Age military industrial complex that is so effective. And we see also that one of the weaknesses of the chariots is with the Hittites at Kadesh. The chariots outstripped their 35,000 man foot army. And basically what ended up happening is, as they overran their own army, they fought the entire Egyptian army, infantry, archers, chariots, and all. And their other troops were just left high and dry. They weren't fast enough to keep up. And then when they got bogged down in the baggage train, they got chewed up by the Egyptian forces that were, on foot. So, and when they escaped, Ramesses II then was able to attack them again and defeat them. But once you have chariot empires, I think warfare becomes more inconclusive. We no longer have these sweeping conquests of India or Egypt, but what instead we have are these inconclusive engagements like at Kadesh. Now, maybe you can fight tribal forces like at Megiddo, where Thutmose III defeats the Canaanite Kadesh alliance with his lighter, faster chariots. But again, that's more of a tribal coalition. They don't really have the Bronze Age military-industrial complex to back them up. And then but once you have empires of roughly equal strength, roughly equal ability to raise large professional forces, it's inconclusive, because Ramesses II fought to gain the city of Kadesh, in part because it was astride an important trade route. But even with the treaty signed with the Hittites, he never took the city. So he might be able to claim a tactical victory in the sense that he did defeat a Hittite chariot corps. But one of the things that Ramesses didn't do was take Kadesh, the very thing he set out to do. So it seems that warfare becomes increasingly inconclusive once both sides use large chariot armies.
Yeah, I think you're right. And this goes a little bit back to the point where chariots are really sort of, well, I don't want to deduce it to just this, but chariots are really effective in the psychological warfare department, as similar to elephants in antiquity. Again, the maintenance of those types of units for a city-state or a kingdom at that time I would imagine, have been intensive compared to just more standard infantry formations. Yeah, like you said, the main objective for the Egyptians was taking Kadesh, but again, due to the partial effectiveness of chariots, I mean, again, they're like kind of this big and cool thing back then, but they required a lot of upkeep, and it's difficult to say what their kill ratio would be. Again, I think they're probably most effective in these large sweeping land conquests, like you were saying earlier, of the Aryan conquest, where you're essentially coming up against people of Stone Age technology and social organization versus people who have got an earlier start at things for whatever particular reason. Again, I don't want to go down too far down the Jared Diamond environmental determinist path, but for the time being, I'll just say that, they were very effective in those types of conflicts. But once you had powers coming up against each other who could more or less evenly match each other, the historical track record, as you said, it becomes kind of sparse in their domination. It's interesting that chariots later on, I think it could be argued, as Caesar observed in Britain and I think later on in earlier on with the wars with Hannibal, that they were used as this battlefield transportation at more and far less than a hammer like Cyrus the Great would have used them.
Yes. Now, the other major military developments at the time would be Sargon of Akkad, the Sumerian warlord who built the world's first empire. Now, the core to his success was having a professional standing army, the one who eat. They were called, paraphrasing it, the one who eat bread at my table, and it was 5,400 trained warriors who were professional soldiers that fought for Sargon. And now there's a stela called the Vulture Stela that many people argue shows ancient Sumerians using hoplite or phalanx warfare. Stelae of the Vultures were the king of Lachish versus the king of Umma. Now, one of the problems with reading these stela is when it comes to trying to interpret chariots, how chariots were constructed, how chariots fought. Sometimes do they have 2, 3, or 4 horses driving them? 4 horses seems kind of like overkill. Like, do you really need 4 horses? Sometimes they have 2, 3, or 4 warriors in them. Now, that might be because these are actually images that are just superimposed on each other and not actually one individual chariot. And some interpreters of the Vulture Stela argue that, well, this is an early example of the phalanx. And many accounts will argue that Sargon used chariots as battlefield taxis. He had a professional shield wall phalanx formation backed up by composite bowmen, and he would use them to crush his enemies and build the first empire. And since they didn't have professional army corps, presumably his army could be deployed in combat longer than those of his opponents. He had this comparative advantage. But the one thing that I sort of question is, how much was this military revolution of Sargon really based on a sort of phalanx formation? Because if we look at the history of the Persians versus the Greeks and the Romans throughout the millennium-long conflict they had with the West, and then later the Arabs with Western Christendom, when it comes to infantry formations, with a few exceptions here and there, West Asian armies are loose order formations, primarily revolving around archers to lay down suppressive missile fire on the enemy, and then lightly armed troops in large numbers to overwhelm the enemy. And this is a trend that we see throughout most of Western Asian military history. And so if they had a phalanx, it's not impossible. But it does seem that, like with the nomadic peoples, their tactical strategy, their whole battle doctrine was consistent over a 3,000-year period, despite changes in technology. And we see also another very highly correlated similarity between the Western Asian armies of fighting in loose order, primarily relying on missile weapons, javelins, arrows, and slings, where the shields are more like you hide behind them so that when the enemy's shooting at you, he doesn't hit you with the arrow, he hits your big, nice wicker shield. So I think you can make just as compelling a case that Sargon's army was not a proto-phalanx, but much like Cyrus's army 2,000 years later, a loose formation of lightly armed infantry with large shields to protect from other incoming arrow fire, and then relying primarily on breaking up the enemy with composite arrow fire. I think that's probably more likely than the proto-phalanx, but I'll hand it over to you now.
Sure. Well, I think by the time Sargon of Akkad comes around, it becomes clear that, military success in this period was dependent on a variety of dynamic units, and that would include, spearmen, javelins, guys with javelins, archers, and some type of a chariot unit. Again, each unit has its own specific role, and that idea of a unit specific role for warfare really came out in this time. One thing that's interesting is that a lot of these rulers of Babylon and Samaria and so on, of the Fertile Crescent, was that these places were most effective under strong warrior kings like Sargon or Namu, and I think it's Shamshi Adad, as well as Hammurabi. All of those that I just named really saw themselves, as from the reading that I've done, they really saw themselves first as military officers, commanders, and second as these civic city-state leaders, but really with a strong emphasis on conquering and tactics. But I don't think that anything. A lot of their opponents would end up being in these loose formations, and if their role wasn't really made specific by their commanders, well, then they were easily defeated by these more disciplined, more specific role-oriented armies, because they knew that they had to do one or two jobs just very well, and that if there's something they couldn't deal with in the army, that there were other units that they would have to rely on to deal with defeating that unit in particular.
Mm-hmm. Now, the other great empire that uses chariots, which we already mentioned, are the Hittites. Now, there is some discussion within the broader debate on how chariots were used. That some people argue the Hittites used their chariots as shock weapons. And again, I argue that before Xenophon, we don't really have any written records of them being used as shock weapons, and that's more of an inference. And furthermore, using Xenophon, he says that the Trojans fought, in this style of the Parthian shot. Now, when we look at the historic Trojan War, was there a Trojan War? If so, what was it like? Well, most people would date this Troy era, that was the time period for the Trojan War, at the time of the Bronze Age collapse, which we won't be getting into in this lecture, but was likely a vassal of the Hittite Empire. And as these great Bronze Age empires begin to weaken, such that this collapse occurs, these outlying regions are more autonomous and are able to have more self-direction. And so that the Greeks, who were fighting Troy, didn't necessarily have to fight the entire Hittite Empire, because the Hittite Empire was weakening, and these local fringe states, while still powerful, were more manageable for aggressive Greek policy. So if we use that as a theory that the Trojans were vassals of the Hittites, it's most likely that the Trojans would have pursued a way of war consistent with the Hittites, and therefore, we could insert Hittite for Trojan way of charioteering for Xenophon. Which, if that's the case, then the Hittites would have fought similarly to the Egyptians. The fact that their chariots were heavier and had more men might indicate that they were using them as battle taxis.
Yeah, that's interesting. With the Hittites coming into Asia Minor around 2000 BC, again, there will always be a debate around, was there a Trojan War or not? Yes, you're right. If in fact they were in existence, well, we know that the Hittites were in power at that point in time, and so it's difficult to imagine Troy, if it had existed at that time, to develop its own sort of unique and very robust and competitive military doctrine with sort of everyone else in the Mediterranean world at that time. Later on in this series, we'll discuss the Sea Peoples and how they kind of were really this, they brought about this savage introduction into the Iron Age. If that were the case, we would have seen Troy probably in the archaeological or historical record make a larger impact. But because because the archaeology of things with Troy is so sparse, it's just hard to say anything concrete. But I do agree with you that they would have functioned as a vassal state of the Hittites, because again, the Hittites had reigning control basically almost over all of Asia Minor at the time, and were making constant military pushes into the Euphrates and into modern day Lebanon and Syria. So yeah, the Hittites were, yeah, they were the bad dude on the block at the time, and probably not the Trojans, or otherwise we probably would have heard about it.
Yeah. Now, the other thing about chariot warfare is that it bears a striking resemblance to medieval knightly warfare in this sense. All the accounts from Homer in Greece, all the way to Chinese accounts in the Shang dynasty and the Zhou dynasty, and in the Egyptian accounts, and even in the biblical accounts, uh, princes, kings, emperors who are in their chariots often seek out um, their counter in the other side's army. They don't go looking for lowly foot soldier with a little spear and a shield. They go looking for the other royalty to fight them in a sort of a ritualized combat, a duel. And it does seem to be the case, especially with the absence of the Hittite forces at Kadesh, that the infantry forces, that is, that a lot of chariot warfare revolved around a kind of once you move to the age where you have competing chariot armies, right, where we move beyond conquering these Stone Age opponents, we're now fighting between chariot armies. When you have these chariot armies fighting each other, much like European chivalry in the Middle Ages, they don't really want to die. I mean, they're living the good life, man. They're at the top of the power pyramid. Everybody's working for them. For them, war is kind of a sport. They do it because they're supposed to do it, but they also don't really want to die either. And so you have this sort of dueling mentality where you look for the other guy's leader. Now, there's also a tactical benefit to that too, because a lot of these armies, as you already mentioned, terminal philosophy, were really only effective if led by a strong war leader. So if you could challenge the enemy leader into a duel and then fight him, and this is where chariots become battle taxis, you drive each other close together to then fight it out. You could decide the battle relatively quickly because the other troops without leadership are just going to melt away. In fact, they probably didn't want to be there in the first place. You probably had to threaten them or do things, that are terrible to get them to go fight anyhow. And for them, it's like, well, just as fine that, I didn't have to fight at all because I got to go back to my farm,
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I'd never thought of putting the medieval chivalry sort of ethos over the top of the way chariots were used in the ancient world. But yeah, that does sort of make sense. I mean, I'm kind of thinking at it from a, like an operational leader or like a general. Again, these it probably takes a long time to domesticate horses, and however much effort it takes, in the modern day. Well, again, with the scarcity of everything in antiquity, it's just a lot of work and a lot of time to get these units up and ready to go for battle, but only to be lost to some low quality conscripted spearman unit is really demoralizing. So yes, I could see them being pensive, or I could see generals being pensive in their use of chariots. And back to the point of requiring strong like warrior kings to maintain these city states in Mesopotamia. I think that was true for both the battlefield right then and there during the battle, as well as after the battles were over and the conquest was over. Well, no one really wanted to mess with this guy, and especially if you ever read, the Code of Hammurabi, yeah, a lot of this stuff is like like local laws and statutes about how to maintain a successful city state, but a lot of it's also like rules about harsh punishment if you fall out of line. So those types of societies and codes are typically best enforced by these alpha warrior king types. Yeah, that's probably my initial thoughts on that.
Yeah. And back to the sort of how we tend to know in Bronze Age Western Asian warfare, as well as China and India and Greece, more about the chariots and the nobles and the princes than we do about the average infantryman in the army. There seems to be a consensus at the moment that a lot of this was or a lot of these infantry formations in Sumeria and the Hittites and Egypt were organized into phalanxes. But again, I just find it bizarre that for a millennium, Western Asia fights in phalanxes, and then by the time the Persians show up, they'd stop. And furthermore, given how effective the Greek phalanx was against the Persians, it's really inconceivable that these Western Asian armies with phalanxes were defeated by Cyrus when the Persians couldn't defeat the Greek phalanx. I think it's far more consistent to think that the Hittites, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians all fought in open, loose order with their infantry, and would. I mean, I was saying they never form shield walls, but again, I just don't see why they do that for a millennium and then just quit. So from Cyrus the Great up until the Ottoman Empire, they stopped doing that. I'm like, I don't know. I don't really buy that. I think it's more likely. And furthermore, we know that loose order formations are not effective against cavalry. That's why Cortez, with a tiny handful of cavalry, could overcome superior Aztec armies. That's why the chariot armies could overcome their Stone Age opponents. They were fighting in loose order formation. And I think the reason why the chariot continued to be so decisive and effective is because most infantry were organized in loose order formation. And furthermore, they were not very well protected. Bronze, again, is a purview of the elite. So unless a champion dismounted to fight, I do remember listening to some lectures where one of the historians said that there might be two vague references to a shield wall in Homer. So it's something that probably happened, but it wouldn't have been like an organized doctrine like the Greeks. I just, and a lot of this is based on speculative interpretations of archaeology. And in general, I think that's, let me put it this way. I think the trajectory of Western Asian military doctrine of loose order infantry combat is a much, much stronger piece of evidence than some vaguely interpreted stela.
I think you're 100% right. For better or for worse, we're still swimming in the world of archaeological interpretation. And a lot of the times, I think even more so today, we're sort of at the mercy and at the subject of the sort of the ideological outlook of the archaeologist who is the lucky one who gets to sort through all this evidence. Now, one thing that we were talking about earlier that I don't think was mentioned is it's important to put all of this warfare in its historical context, meaning that warfare at this time was very much aristocratic. It was small scale compared to later historical eras, and it was highly concentrated geographically. So again, if we've been talking about Kadesh for a minute now, Kadesh again was centered around, I mean, who knows what the size of Kadesh was at the time, but it was politically important for both of these powers to basically draw a definitive border between the Egyptian Empire and the Hittites. So, and the numbers that we're talking here are, I think both the armies were below the number of 10,000, although again, since this is so highly speculative and the actual evidence that exists for it is just so lacking, that's really the best that we have to go off of. Again, one interesting thing about the chariot too is that it while it's really good, it's well implemented in geography where the land is very flat and expansive. But if you've got something like battles of the Old Testament, like Mount Gilboa, I don't think that chariot formations would be very useful in a setting like that. And again, they're very subject to as well that they're subject to the commander of the chariots, who probably wants to hang on to them for later conflicts, and they don't just want to easily lose them in battle, like standard spearmen or something like that. So yeah.
Well, the other thing too, I actually think this is actually an important point to bring up with relation to the history of warfare. A lot of, especially ancient history, and the further back you go in ancient history, when we have to deal with pictorial representations rather than written representations, there tends to be this temptation to overvalue artistic visual expressions of war. Now, if somebody, from 2,000 years in the future were to be able to actually watch American war movies, you would say he'd be daft to get a view of how real war is by watching Saving Private Ryan or, watching The Thin Red Line. But that's not how you're going to get an account of actual combat, because it's art, it's entertainment, it's meant to be entertaining and also to tell a story. So for these stela that are erected by these alpha males, if you will, they're trying to basically brag and boast about how badass they are. So they're also going to make their guy look bigger, the other guys look smaller. They're also going to make the other guy look more numerous because, hey, I beat this whole horde of enemies, because I'm so awesome. And how reliable really is that, looking at pictorial representation of warfare? I mean, we wouldn't try to repaint. Nobody would seriously take reconstructing World War II battles from watching movies about World War II.
Yeah, the task of comparing warfare and entertainment versus probably how it was actually carried out is just its own sort of unique and frustrating shitstorm. I mean, again, most people get their aesthetic cues of World War II from Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers, and they are good pieces of entertainment on their own, right? I mean, they are, but again, you get this, as far as World War II goes, you get this, which is what is essentially you could call Allied propaganda to this point. And the best that you can hope for is like, yeah, maybe there were a few good Germans, but for the most part they were all just the quintessence of evil and so on and so forth. And that also applies to the ancient world. I mean, again, maybe this isn't highly relevant to the Sumerians and the Egyptians and the Hittites like we were just talking about, but in the movie Troy, I mean, the armies that are fielded are just these enormous formations that you would see out of Lord of the Rings or something. Whereas, if you were to really implement some historical accuracy on those scenes, I don't think those armies would be even half that size. So, I mean, again, that's just due to logistics and the scarcities of food, and I mean, we're thousands of years before materialistic and logistical things like the Green Revolution. So, yeah, I mean, again, I don't think it's kind of like an easy topic to digest, but it can't be overstated enough that there really is just this mythical contrast between entertainment and how things are presented aesthetically and how things were performed in antiquity. The size of the armies at Kadesh, again, they were just a couple of thousand per each side. And again, whether or not I'm correct in that, like, again, we're talking about under 10,000 per side. I'm fairly confident in that.
And I think the last thing we'll discuss is the limitations of the chariot and why it was ultimately replaced. One of the limitations of the chariot is that it violates the principle of KISS, keep it simple, stupid. There's too many working parts in the carriage that can break, and when it breaks, the chariot's useless. So it's highly finicky. If you have a saddle on a horse, there's a lot less that can break. I mean, the horse could break, but with a chariot, you have not one, but at least 2 or 3 horses that can break, and then the cart, which can break. And that definitely makes it more finicky. Furthermore, you have to have really you have to have flat terrain. You can't be a lot of obstacles, man-made or otherwise. And once we see the art of fieldcraft develop, and man-made obstacles are become more and more of a thing, then it becomes a lot harder for chariots to operate. And then with the invention of the saddle, a lone archer on a horse has roughly as good or better firing platform than the chariot. And since the chariot itself was meant to be a firing platform, it ceases to be relevant. I mean, that could in part be why Cyrus tried to reinvent the chariot, because the Assyrians with their horse archers had fundamentally changed the game, and the chariot needed a new tactical system. But and furthermore, it's not an efficient use of horses. So you have one man for one horse with the saddle. Then for every four horses, you can have four riders and four warriors. Whereas with a chariot, like an Egyptian style, you can only have two. And with the Hittite style, you can only have one. So it's a much more effective use of horses and of manpower. So these are some of the weaknesses of the chariot, which would inevitably lead to its replacement by horsemen and cavalry in general.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You nailed all the logistical points on the chariot just fine. Like you said, it requires specialized logistics, which again, logistics in antiquity, I mean, they were suffering with logistics in warfare long, long after that into the era of Napoleon and beyond that. So you can imagine how difficult things would be to replace, again, like certain parts, or, I think they, like the axles for chariots would have been very difficult to replace on a battlefield. I know that this isn't an ancient example, but in the book Death Traps by Belton Y. Cooper, he was a U.S. Army officer in the Armored Corps, and one of the reasons why the Western Allied Tank Corps was so successful is because many of the Shermans and Stuarts and chieftains that were partially destroyed, the reason why they could come back onto the battlefield several days later, or even a little bit longer than that, is because we had such an immense surplus of hardware and spare parts, not to mention trained mechanics that were ready, that were ready to fix these tanks at a moment's notice. They would, in Normandy, he talks about in that book how they had certain like wrecking areas where they would tow in these, what appeared to be completely destroyed tanks, and they'd swap out the motors, and they would wash out all the blood, and replace the ammunition and a bunch of other things, but otherwise it was still a serviceable vehicle. So were those types of logistical systems in place during the ancient world? I mean, we can only speculate really, but you know we can only look to later wars as to why certain like technical pieces of military hardware are successful, and it's because that there are men that are trained to man them, there are men that are trained to work on them if they're broken, and the mechanics or the men that are trained to work on them have material availability. And I really do think that the chariot is just it. While it looks really cool, and a lot of us, like when we were growing up, and we have like these historical, like these military atlases, we have a lot of cool depictions of chariots, and they probably, again, I think we can all agree more or less, at least you and I can agree, that they were well implemented in these large land conquests that went all the way down to the Indus from Central Eurasia. Yes, those were very effective then. But again, once you have militaries where it's chariot versus chariot, well, they kind of start canceling each other out, and they end up being more trouble and more cumbersome than they're actually worth. And as a result, you have the Assyrians that introduced the use of cavalry in the early 9th century BC. And so everything changed after that. After you have the stirrup, the saddle, and iron, oh man, like warfare's changed forever at that point.
Yeah, so we're about out of time. Is there anything that you'd like to leave us with before we wrap up?
Not a ton. No, this has been a great conversation. I'll just say that, yeah, things will start to get a lot more interesting now that we're going to be entering the Iron Age and the sea peoples of the Aegean Sea and Asia Minor. And yeah, again, I think I've covered everything that I wanted to on the chariot, as well as some of these early formations. But no, thanks for having me as always, man. It's been great.
All right, this is Todd Lewis of the Prez of Folly podcast, signing off.